The barn was still warm from the animals when he told me what he needed. It was our wedding night, and I had imagined many things about how it would begin, but not this. Not a lantern in one hand, and my husband's other hand on the small of my back, walking me out across the frozen yard away from the house, away from the warm bed, away from everything I thought this night was supposed to be. The snow crunched under my good shoes. My breath hung white in front of my face. And behind us, through the kitchen window, I could still see my mother washing the last of the wedding dishes, believing her daughter was safe and married and blessed. Before I tell you what he required of me in that barn, and before I tell you why, under our rules, he was completely within his rights to ask it, let me introduce myself. My name is Martha. I grew up old order Amish, and this is Hannah, the Amish girl, the channel where I share the truths we were raised to carry in silence for the rest of our lives. If you want to understand what plain life is actually like, not the postcard version the tourists photograph from their cars, but the real thing from the inside, subscribe and tap the like button. And tell me in the comments before you hear the rest, what do you imagine an Amish husband is allowed to require of his new wife? I want to know what you think before I tell you the truth. Now, let me explain something, because I know the title alone has your mind running in one direction, and I need you to slow down and hear this properly. In the Amish world, marriage is not a partnership the way the English understand it. The word we use, the word the bishop preaches, is submission. A wife submits, a husband leads. That is the order of things, and it is not presented as cruelty. It is presented as God's design, as old as Scripture, as settled as the seasons. From the time you are a small girl braiding your hair in the dark before dawn, you are taught that one day you will belong to a household. And in that household, your will bends to his. But here is what people outside our world never understand. That authority is not only about the bedroom, the way outsiders always assume. It is about everything. It is about labor. It is about the farm. It is about what a wife owes the moment she takes those vows. And on a wedding night, a husband is permitted to require of his new bride whatever the work of the household demands. Not romance, not rest. Work. And in my case, on the coldest night of my life, the work was in the barn. I married Amos in late November, on a Thursday, after the harvest was in. I was 19. He was 24. And he had a reputation in our district as a hard worker, a serious man, a good match. My parents were proud. 300 people came. The ceremony ran nearly 4 hours on those hardwood benches. Sermon after sermon about the godly household, about the wife who yields, about the vine and the branches. I remember my feet aching in my shoes. I remember thinking that I was hungry, and that I was frightened, and that I did not truly know the man I had just promised my whole life to. We had bundled during our courtship, the way couples in my community did. We had lain together fully clothed in my childhood bedroom, talking in the dark about the farm he would build and the children God might send. He had seemed gentle then, careful. He had never once mentioned that the first thing he would ask of me as his wife would have nothing to do with love at all. The wedding meal went late. Roast chicken and mashed potatoes and gravy thick as paste, chouflée pie sweet enough to make your teeth ache, coffee and wood smoke, and the low hum of 300 voices. My cheeks hurt from smiling at people I barely knew. And then, when the last of the guests had finally gone, and the house had gone quiet, and my mother was at the sink, Amos took the lantern from its hook by the door and said the words I have never forgotten. He said, "Come, the cow is close to calving, and I will not lose a calf on my wedding night." I want to be completely honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because the truth is complicated. I felt confused. I felt a strange, cold disappointment settle into my chest. And underneath it, I felt something I did not have a word for yet, something that took me years and a great deal of therapy to finally name. I felt that I had just been shown, in the plainest possible terms, exactly where I ranked in my own marriage. Below the animals, below the work. A wife before she was ever a bride. So, I followed him out into the snow, still in my wedding dress, with a heavy coat thrown over it, and my prayer cap pinned to my head. I walked into that barn on my wedding night. And there in the straw was the cow laboring, her sides heaving, her eyes rolling white in the lantern light. Amos knelt down beside her and looked up at me and said, "I need your hands. They are smaller than mine. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So, I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now let me tell you what happened in that barn, because it is not what you are bracing yourself to hear, and that is exactly the point I need you to understand about how our world works. The calf was turned wrong. Amos knew it, and I knew it, because any Amish girl raised on a farm has seen 100 births by the time she is grown. My hands were smaller than his, and a birth gone wrong sometimes needs small hands, patient hands, hands that can find what is tangled and turn it right without tearing anything. So, on my wedding night, in my wedding dress, with the cold biting through every layer of cloth, I knelt in the straw beside my new husband and I did the work. It took most of an hour. My arms ached, my good dress was ruined. And when that calf finally came free and drew its first shuddering breath, and the cow turned to lick it clean, Amos sat back on his heels in the lantern light and looked at me with something on his face I had not expected at all. Not pride in himself, gratitude and exhaustion, and a kind of raw, frightened honesty. He said, "I did not know how to be a husband today. I only know how to work. So, I brought you to the thing I know." And that broke something open in me, because I understood then that he was as lost as I was. 24 years old, handed a wife and a farm and a whole future, and given no more instruction on how to love a person than I had been given. We were two frightened young people who had been taught every rule about duty and not one single word about tenderness. He knew how to save a calf. Nobody had ever taught him how to hold a wife. Here is what I need you to understand, and this is the part that took me the longest to make peace with. My mother had done this, and her mother before her. There is a whole unspoken understanding among Amish women that a wife's first duty is the work, and that everything softer must wait until the work allows it. My friend Rebecca married a year before I did. She told me once, whispering over a quilting frame so no one else would hear, that her own wedding night was spent canning the last of the tomatoes because a warm spell had ripened them all at once, and her husband would not let the harvest spoil. She said she cried into the steam so he would not see. She said she thought there was something wrong with her for wanting more than that, and that is when I began to understand the real shape of it. It was never one cruel man. Amos was not cruel. Amos, in his own clumsy, frightened way, was trying. The cruelty was in the system that had raised us both, that told a girl her body and her hands and her hours belonged to the household from the moment she said the vow, and told a boy that providing and requiring were the whole of what a husband was. Neither of us was given the tools to want more, and both of us wanted more, and neither of us had the words to say so. We walked back to the house near dawn, both of us filthy, both of us shaking with cold. And in the kitchen, in the dark, Amos did something no one had taught him to do. He heated water on the stove without being asked. He warmed a cloth and he handed it to me and he said, "I am sorry it was like this. I will try to be better than what I was shown." And for a moment, standing in that cold kitchen in my ruined wedding dress, I believed him. And the strange thing, the thing I still turn over in my mind all these years later, is that he mostly kept that promise. Not perfectly, not the way an English husband might, but he tried in a world that had never once modeled for him what trying looked like. But I want to be clear about the cost, because I will not sit here and pretend it was a love story. There were years after that when the work always came first. Always. When I lost a pregnancy alone because the mare was foaling and he could not be spared. When I learned to swallow the wanting the way my mother had and her mother, the way Rebecca, the canning steam. A wife yields, a husband leads, and the leading always pointed toward the work. When I finally left at 28, the cost was immediate and total. shunning the Maidong. My letters home returned unopened. My mother's silence on the telephone the one time I dared to call. My father's door closed to me as though I had died, and in their world, I had. To leave is to be mourned by people who are still breathing. In therapy years later, I learned words that did not exist in the language I was raised in. Autonomy, consent, personhood. I learned that a woman's hours are her own to give and not another's to require. My therapist said something to me once that I have carried every single day since. She said, "Control does not always announce itself as harm. Sometimes it simply calls itself duty and asks you to be grateful for it." And I grieve the girl who knelt in that straw in her wedding dress, doing her duty, believing that was all a wife was ever meant to be. She was not wrong to be gentle. She was not wrong to want more. She was only young and unarmed and taught that the wanting itself was a kind of sin. The Amish world gave me things I will carry for the rest of my life. A community with AA the English will never quite know. A work ethic that has kept me standing through every hard year since I left. A faith that is wounded and complicated and somehow still real. But there is no scripture that requires a woman to disappear into the labor of a household until there is nothing left of her but her hands. There is no God I believe in now who made a woman only to be required of and never once to be asked. If you were raised in a place where your worth was measured only in what you could do for others, I see you. If you were ever taught that your own wanting was pride, was weakness, was sin, and that silence was the same thing as being good, I see you too. You were not too much. You were never too much. You were simply never told that you were allowed to be more than useful. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.